This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Ben. Today and this week, we're going to be continuing our series of A New Church, A New World. But now we're going to shift our focus. The last 2 weeks, we have been focusing on secularization and then the culture around the church in what has been called the none zone in the Pacific Northwest. But today, we're going to take our turn of, if we've already talked about a new world, now we turn to the new church. What is going on in the church? Because sometimes we can, in our conversations about secularization from 2 weeks ago, and last week with the focus in the Pacific Northwest, on reverential naturalism and individualism, sometimes we can create a very much those people who have those views as compared to those in churches who don't. But I'd like to challenge us today to say, what is going on in churches? How does this look? Where does it show up? And what is the new world as expressed in the new church? And so what I'd like to do is introduce us into what I would call a new kind of illiteracy. Now, for a long time, it has been suggested there has been a biblical illiteracy and people simply don't know what's going on, especially outside of the church. But I actually think it's in a very specific way. That Christianity is less unknown as much as which emphasis is known versus not known. And to do that, I'd like to look at some of the research of David Kinnaman, who was part of the Barna Research Group and did research on all churches in America. And it won't be just about the Northwest, but they wrote, he with a co-author, wrote a book almost a decade ago now, called Unchristian, or in fact, over a decade ago, called Unchristian. What are the associations, especially for younger people, on one of how they view Christianity and what the future might be? And the results are quite interesting, because the results of their study said, well, just give me your impressions. What is Christianity? And there were some things that were positive, some things that were negative. And the things that were negative are probably not too surprising to hear about. For example, they felt that the church was very anti-LGBTQIA, very judgmental, very hypocritical, felt that they were very out of touch, and felt that churches are simply too political. Negatives, and there were others too, but you get the sense of what these are. Now, the positive associations they held were there was seeing the values held as positive, that Christians are friendly, that there was a real respect for the faith that was there, the expressions of love, hope, and that generally we were dealing with a very trustworthy bunch, these Christians. Now, this list might not surprise you too much, but there might be one huge glaring absence that you might notice. What is being expressed? What is not being expressed? If you look at these, there's one big thing not expressed anywhere, which is anything about who Jesus is. We have affect. We have they're judgmental, they're hypocritical, they're out of touch. They're anti-science is another one. And then we have the affect. They're very friendly, they're very loving, they provide hope, they're very trustworthy. But what we're lacking is any content at all in what is being expressed. Kinnaman wrote a follow-up book called You Lost Me, analyzing who has been leaving the church, especially younger people, and why. And in doing so, he says, well, there were really 6 reasons that were being presented of why people have been leaving the church, especially younger people. They felt it was overprotective and restrictive, not allowing people to express themselves meaningfully. 2, they found it very shallow or boring. Not much to it in its expression. They thought it was very anti-science. They thought it was very repressive, especially in sexual ethics. Found it very exclusive. And called doubtless, meaning not providing an opportunity for doubt or questioning. Now, these, once again, we see why are people leaving? What's there and what's missing? We seem to have a lot of affects, but one thing we don't have is anything about the content of what's actually being expressed. What's going on here? How is this happening? And I'd like to suggest, especially for those of us in liberal churches where you say, well, we don't have many of these problems like anti-science or being repressive or being exclusive or not allowing for doubt. But what do we have? Well, this question, are we allowing expression? Is this really presenting this in a meaningful way? And I'd like to suggest an analysis provided by Freese and Bader called America's Four Gods. And what they're doing is trying to map what's going on in American Christianity today and saying you can kind of map on an X and Y axis where churches have kind of become based on how engaged they see God and how judgmental they see God. So, for example, there is the authoritative God. The authoritative God, very engaged in the world and very judgmental. This might be the radical fundamentalists who are saying that natural disasters are God punishing the world. Then you can have a critical God, one who they express a very judgmental God, but not very engaged in the world, meaning it is very judgmental, but right now it is a language of forbearance. God is holding back this judgment until Jesus returns again. So very judgmental, but not acting in the day-to-day life. Then you have the benevolent God, very engaged in the world, but not very judgmental. God acts and works for people's productivity, not people's cost. And then you can have the very distant God, meaning one who's not very engaged and not very judgmental. This you might have the language of classic deism. It's just God's not very involved anymore. Maybe created the world, but then afterward kind of left it alone and humans to do their own thing. Well, another scholar has looked at doing his own surveys of younger people, has said there is a concept of moralistic, therapeutic deism. This is a scholar by the name of Christian Smith. And what it's really leaning into is, well, it's deistic. It's a very distant God. It's this idea that, well, God's not really very present in our regular lives. But God does provide morals by which we ought to live our lives. And also, if we are personally going through something, it's therapeutic. It helps us emotionally and process who we are. And so emotional and spiritual care basically become the same thing. And so what we have is a very distant God. And this research has all been about young people, but they didn't research older people. I'm not so sure that this distinction is so wild, but because historically, Lutheran churches would have been very much here with God. That there was a judgmental God, not just everyone is being saved, but that that is going to be held out until Jesus returns. In recent years, there has been much more of a shift in mainline congregations into a benevolent God. God who is always for you, God who is always for your benefit, not for your judgment. The problem is, in so doing, frequently, I think there is a possibility of aiming to express the benevolent God, and you end up presenting the distant God. God who really doesn't have all that much to do with your day-to-day life. No Lutheran theology supports that, but it can be heard. And this is where we very well might have this lack of seeing in all of this research anything about the cross. Seeing what is the heart of our religiosity. And this has been this whole movement into authenticity has been calling for that. It's not you to be authentically yourselves, but you to hold the very faith you have, which our faith is from outside of us, or in Latin, extra nos, and that our authentic faith is coming from the cross. This presents an incredible opportunity to say, who are we? Have we been presenting a shallow faith accidentally by aiming to present a God who loves you, and in so doing, not presenting a God who is very active? We don't mean to do that, but has it been happening? We will talk more about this on our class on Tuesday evening, but for now, this is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben.